all day for years. Maybe the woman fashion. I love seeing baby those with those I bought. From New York. Still very soft. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Happy spring, everybody. Believe it or not, today's the first day of spring, so happy spring. It is also right before Purim, and today's actually the fast of Esther, but we don't fast because we've got Hamantashen. So happy Purim. They're all different flavors. I'd love to say I stood and baked, but those actually came from New York. But if the building smells like fresh Hamantashen, it's because the day school was baking Hamantashen today. So the nice aroma worked for our program today. A couple of things I just want to remind people about. The spring program guide should be arriving in your mailboxes in the next day or two. It will look like this, except it will have flowers on it and a cute little girl. So this is what you're going to want to hold on to, because it's going to have all the programs in it through June. Okay? And we've started taking reservations for the 2 theater trips. If you'd like to pick one up and reserve that today, it's right on the table, as well as the Senior Seder, which is a completely, okay, I'll only one at a time. It's a complete Senior Seder. It's a formal Seder. We have the whole Seder plate. We have a chicken lunch. It's at B'nai Israel. It's catered. So if you haven't signed up for that and you're here, please do so. It's really quite a lovely afternoon. And even if you have opportunities to go to your own Seders, this is a great time to come and spend it with your friends. So you're not going to be completely tired of matzah by that point in time, because it's not a kosher for Passover Seder. So we still kind of fudge a little. Nah. And so, any questions about this, you can grab me at the end. I knew you were going to do that to me. We're going to have a special program sometime for Dave, and it's going to be open mic night, so we can just let him get it all out there, okay? We'll schedule that for fall. Yeah, I have to bring the computer out and everything, so y'all can watch for that program in the fall, okay? You and I, we'll get a date on the calendar. So, without further ado, it really is my pleasure and my honor to be able to introduce a local Toledoan who has taken the time, lots of time, and effort into writing a really wonderful book, and I'm going to read kind of the little bit of the abridged, and then I'm going to let you kind of expand on that. It is my honor to introduce Charles Weinblatt. He is the author of Jacob's Courage, a Holocaust Love Story. Jacob's Courage is a beautiful love story set against the backdrop of the Holocaust. Jacob's Courage chronicles the dazzling beauty of passionate love and enduring bravery in a lurid world where the innocent are brutally murdered. Mr. Weinblatt will share his inspiration and journey on developing his book, and we will also have the honor of hearing some excerpts. Sorry, long day. So without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Weinblatt.
Thank you, Renee. First of all, a few ground rules. Please forgive me for sitting down. I'd be happy to stand up and do this, but I've had some unsuccessful spine surgeries, and I probably wouldn't last a minute or two if I was standing up. So I apologize for being seated. This is not a school or a lecture. I'd rather have this be more of a discussion. So at any time, feel free to speak up, ask a question, bring up a concern, raise your hand. If you can't hear me, also raise your hand and I'll try to speak a little bit louder. What I'd like to do today is begin with some brief biographical information so you know a little bit more about who I am and how I got to this point. And then I will talk a little bit about the book, why I wrote it, how I wrote it, some of the inspiration behind it. I'll read a few excerpts and then I'll take whatever questions you might have. So I'll try not to keep you here too long. First, before I begin, I would be remiss if I did not express some appreciation to some people who are here today, without whose constant love and support and encouragement, I probably wouldn't have tried to write a novel, much less get it published. So I'd like to recognize three people who are in the room today. In the back of the room, my wife, Fran. Sitting next to Fran is our son, Brian. And in the front row here in red, Evelyn Auslander, my mother-in-law. Okay, we're here to talk about Jacob's Courage, a book that took me about 3 years to research and write. It is about 90% fiction. A little bit of biographical information before we begin. I was born here in Toledo. I grew up in the near Old Orchard area. Graduated from DeVilbiss High School in the same class with Fran, 1970. Graduated from the University of Toledo in 1974 with a bachelor's degree and a major in psychology. I worked for 30 years until my back finally reached the point where I couldn't. The first half of my career, I was involved in counseling, psychiatric counseling and vocational rehabilitation counseling. The second half of my career was with the University of Toledo. I began with the Division of Continuing Education as a program manager, and in 1995 I was given the opportunity to create my own division at the university, which was called Organization Development. Basically, our job was to go out into the business community and help organizations improve their performance utilizing the resources of university faculty and consultants from the community. And I did that until my retirement in 2004. Since then, I've been writing. I can't do very much work anymore, so I guess a cripple with a laptop can still be productive. Which brings us to writing Jacob's Courage. I don't think I gave much thought to the Holocaust until I was a young adult, perhaps in college. I had, also by way of biographical information, my father was Dr. Morris Weinblatt. He was born in 1904 on 14th Street here in Toledo. He was a football star at Scott High School and at the University of Toledo. He also played football in medical school at the University of Michigan. After medical school, he had some internships in psychiatry, and in 1933 he became the City of Toledo's first full-time psychiatrist. And my dad was a tremendous source of inspiration to me. The book is dedicated to him, as well as the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. My mother was born in 1909 in Russia, in a small village called Kovel, which was not far from Kiev. As a child, she experienced some traumatic events as a result of pogroms. The Cossacks would periodically come into the village bent on rape and murder and theft, and my mother witnessed some pretty horrific events as a child. Her father found work in the United States around 1920 and sent for the family to join him in Columbus. Along the way, my mother got separated from her family at the age of 7, and she happened to be caught in some nasty battles in World War I, wandering around the fields of Russia with bombs falling. At one point, a German soldier took care of her for a while and managed to locate her aunt, who was living in Russia. And then my mother later rejoined her sisters and her mother in the United States. One of the characters in the book is based on my mother's experiences, and and she has been a tremendous resource as well. Probably when I was a young adult, maybe in college, I became aware of the fact that some of my relatives, my maternal relatives, perished in the Holocaust. I didn't know them. I had no particular frame of reference to connect with them, but it disturbed me. And the more I thought about it, the more concerned and connected I became. It occurred to me around that time that if I had been born 9 years earlier in Europe instead of the United States, I might have been with them when they perished. So the older I got, the more connected I began to feel with the Holocaust. But when you're working and raising a family, things like writing seem to fall far behind in the list of priorities. So I waited until I retired in 2004 to do something about my interest in the Holocaust. I thought that as I began writing, I might be able to do research and writing at the same time, and that perhaps my research would take 3 or 4 months. And that wasn't true. In fact, I ended up still doing research when the book was almost finished, almost 3 years later. I decided that if I was going to write a book about the Holocaust, that if the characters are fictional, at least everything else in the book ought to be based in fact. So while I made up the characters, everything that happened to those people happened to real Jews during the Holocaust. Every place they went, in fact, had relevance to the Holocaust. It was either a ghetto or it was a concentration camp, and even the names of some of the Nazi generals are accurate to the period. So the characters are fictional, but what happened to the characters actually happened to real people, possibly even some of my own relatives. Okay, that's the biographical information, a little bit of background on why I decided to write the book. Writing is probably the only thing that I can do with some degree of proficiency. And I have to be honest in telling you that I'm terrible with math. I have no engineering or mechanical skill whatsoever, and I'm dangerous with tools. So writing is probably the only thing that I was able to do with some degree of proficiency, and that's why I decided to delve into it in retirement. The period of time covered in this book begins in late 1939, and there are 3 major characters, and basically there are 4 characters that we follow throughout the Holocaust. It begins in a city in Austria called Salzburg. Salzburg is a beautiful city in the mountains of northern Austria. It's the home city of Mozart. So it's got a long history of artisans and shops of all kinds. It's basically a tourist city, and always has been. People from all over Europe visit Salzburg and have done so for the last few centuries. The major character in my book is a 17-year-old boy named Jacob Silverman. Like the biblical Jacob, this Jacob has prophetic dreams. At first he denies that there's any relevance to the future, but as the book goes on, he begins to discover that his dreams, as horrible as they are, begin to come true. They're actually happening in life. And that's a very frightening experience for him. Jacob is the only child of Moshe and Hannah Silverman. Jacob's father, Moshe, is a physician in Salzburg, and a very well-known and highly regarded physician. He's well-liked by everyone. His fatal flaw, though, is that he doesn't get his family out in time. Even when he was warned and even when he was cajoled by others to do so, he was wrapped up in his job, his practice, his patients, and like so many others, assumed that the Nazi threat would just pass. His wife, Hannah, who he met as a child, served in the community food bank as a volunteer. She helped with the school. She was a housewife who was involved in the community. And the Jewish community of Salzburg was not very large. There might have been a couple hundred Jews in the city at that time. The other main character for the book is Jacob's girlfriend, Rachel Goldberg. Jacob and Rachel are very much in love as the book begins. And they are both planning to attend university together, medical school together. Like their fathers, who are both physicians, they plan to go into medicine as well. So as the book begins in 1939, life is good. They've had fun with school. They attend school with Gentiles and Jews. Their future is planned out for them. Their parents are good, nurturing people who raised them as good Jews. So in 1939, life is pretty good, except that the Nazis had just arrived. The book will follow the family from their comfortable flat in Salzburg to a ghetto where they were evicted. And they spent some time in a very, very nasty place. All the Jews were pulled out of school. They could no longer attend school with Gentiles. Jacob's father, Moshe, could no longer practice medicine with a Gentile. And life begins to crumble around them slowly and surely. They go from the ghetto to a concentration camp called Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was not a killing camp. It was a transition camp. It was a place where the Nazis could put Jews and other undesirables in sort of a holding place. But the real final solution, of course, involved the killing of the Jews. So when they lived at Theresienstadt, and they were there for a couple of years, every single day they lived in fear of deportation. And every day, trains took people out of Theresienstadt. While they were in Theresienstadt, Jacob and Rachel became more deeply involved romantically and were married by a rabbi in the camp. It was not a legal thing to do. The Nazis didn't allow that, but they got married in Theresienstadt. Jacob developed plans for escape. He keeps having these dreams. At first, the dream was a warning that he would end up in some terrible place with fires burning and things going into the fire. And then he had dreams of leading people in escape. And so Jacob and his comrades actually dug a tunnel to escape from Theresienstadt. And in fact, that happened in real life. There were 2 or 3 escapes from Theresienstadt by tunnel before the Nazis managed to grab hold of the idea of what these people were doing. Something terrible happened to Rachel while she was at Theresienstadt. She was a school teacher, and the camp commandant, an evil Nazi colonel, consistently went into the school and harassed her, but in a loving way. He obviously had his eyes on her, and it made her feel terrible. One day he called her into his office, locked the door, and raped her. A couple months later, she's pregnant. She escapes with Jacob through the tunnel. Jacob's parents couldn't escape. Jacob's mother was sick with typhus. Jacob's father, Moshe, again being the perfect physician, wouldn't leave his patients. So Jacob and Rachel escaped and joined the partisans who were in the area of what at that time was turned into Czechoslovakia. And in fact, there were Jews that escaped from Theresienstadt and joined the partisans there. In fact, I used the actual name of the leader of the partisans there, Anton Khrushchev, in the book. And Anton, like the camp commandant at Theresienstadt, falls in love with Rachel. Their escape is short-lived, at least for Jacob. They go out on a mission to destroy a Nazi train carrying troops and ammunition. Jacob is shot and recaptured. Now the Gestapo gets involved because they know that Jacob has information about the partisans. So Jacob is tortured over a period of several months, starved, beaten, nearly electrocuted. Some of the torture involved what today would be called waterboarding, something the CIA is not supposed to be doing. And he won't tell them a thing. He'd rather die than give them information about the partisans. And finally, he's eating bugs off the floor just to stay alive. But time passes, and he barely survives. The Nazis let him go. The Gestapo let him go back into the camp. He joins his parents in a very emotional reunion. And about 2 weeks later, they're deported to Auschwitz, the three of them. Meanwhile, Rachel is still with the partisans and getting more pregnant every day. She ends up delivering her baby with the help of Anton, the leader of the partisans. And they go through hell in order to get her to a safe place to have her baby. Meanwhile, Jacob keeps having more dreams, and these dreams again keep coming true. In his dreams, he saw what was eventually Auschwitz. And as the train pulls up to Auschwitz and he looks through the slats of the car, he sees the place from his dream. And this is driving him crazy. His dreams keep coming true over and over again. What does it mean? And Jacob has a lot of faith. So he comes to believe that these dreams are a gift from God, like the biblical Jacob. And as time goes on in Auschwitz, he refuses to die. At one point, he was shot in the leg during his escape with partisans, and his leg gets worse and worse and worse. He can no longer work in the munitions plant at Auschwitz, and anybody at Auschwitz that can't work is a dead person because they're no longer useful. So just before Jacob is sent to the gas chamber, he receives a gift, and the gift is a violin. When Jacob was in school as a child, he learned how to play the violin with moderate success. He wasn't a prodigy by any means. When he was at Theresienstadt, he played in the orchestra there, and there was a Jewish orchestra at Theresienstadt, just like there was a Jewish school there. And in the orchestra, he finds some of the great virtuoso musicians from all of Europe. And by 1940, late 42, Theresienstadt's population has swollen from a few thousand to 100,000. So you've got all of these virtuoso musicians, including violin players, and Jacob had a chance to learn from them, and his skill as a violinist improved dramatically. So just as he's about to die in Auschwitz, he receives the gift of this violin, and he uses it to work his way into the orchestra and keep himself alive. The only problem is that every day playing in the orchestra, Jacob is forced to look at the long lines of people waiting for the gas chamber. And it wears on his mind deeply. Each day that passes, he feels more and more guilty for surviving as he watches these people walk through line, especially the faces of the children. It haunts him. It will haunt him forever. Rachel, meanwhile, has the baby, and I'm not going to tell you at this point who the father was, because you can still buy the book. But Anton found a Jewish couple hiding out in a farmhouse, pretending to be Gentiles, and they agreed to take the baby so that Rachel could rejoin the partisans and fight with them, which she did, and she turned into a magnificent fighter. but she couldn't stand being away from Jacob. She went into the Theresienstadt camp, found out that Jacob and his parents had already been deported to Auschwitz. So a few months later, she worked out a plan to go into Auschwitz. She actually broke into the worst killing camp in the history of mankind in order to rescue and save her husband, Jacob. And Jacob, meanwhile, not only stayed alive, but was able to collect a great deal of information. Fortunately, the Germans were great record keepers. They kept track of every single person who came into every single concentration camp. And by 1940, late 43, Allied bombers were going over Auschwitz on almost a daily or nightly basis. But they wouldn't destroy the camp. They destroyed munitions factories that were around the camp, but not the camp itself. So Jacob figured if he could get enough information to the Allied command, that maybe they would just send one squadron of bombers to take out the camp and save untold thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So he has his friends in Auschwitz collect this information, photographs, prison records, information about medical experiments, and so on. And he gives this to Rachel. But as they're getting ready to escape together, Jacob's leg collapses. He tripped on something and fell. So he couldn't escape with Rachel. But he gave the information to somebody else, and that other person, that friend, escaped with Rachel. Did you have a question? Okay. Jacob sinks into a morass of depression. He's been beaten, starved. He has bouts of typhus. He can't tolerate looking at people while he's playing his violin. His life is just crumbling. And time is going on. And finally, the orchestra is disbanded. And the reason was they'd already killed almost all the Jews that they wanted to kill. The only ones left were the Jews who were in the camp and working in the factories next to it. And at that point, Jacob becomes Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando were the people who worked in the crematoria. And he had to feed the bodies into the fire. And that was his first dream, his first nightmare that occurred way back at the end of 1939. He dreamt of bodies in a huge fire, and it actually came to pass. As he struggles to stay alive, he gets a message from his father. His father, Moshe, the physician, was assigned to work with Dr. Josef Mengele at Auschwitz, performing medical experiments. And for many months, Moshe escaped from the task of having to kill anyone. He was doing autopsies, removing organs, or treating people. Finally, he's assigned to a project where he will have to inject benzene into people's bloodstreams as a medical experiment. And that really was one of the medical experiments performed at Auschwitz. So Moshe decides, finally, that he's going to do something magnificent with his life. He made too many bad decisions. He will die killing a Nazi doctor who he's supposed to be working with. Just before he does that, he writes a letter to Jacob, explaining why he won't be able to be with him and Rachel any longer. That's very touching, and Jacob's at virtually the end of his life. And just before he's ready to give up completely, he has another dream. It's a dream of him leading prisoners in a battle for their survival, an actual military battle. And it didn't make sense to him until at the very end, when Auschwitz was cleared out. There were only a few thousand people left. and the Russians were approaching the camp from the east. And just before the Russians reached the camp, the Nazis marched every Jew, every prisoner from Auschwitz to the camp. This really happened. It was called the Auschwitz Death March. It happened in January 1945. And before it happened, Jacob had the dream of marching across the frozen Polish countryside, reaching a certain spot, and starting a rebellion where he would lead his fellow prisoners in a gallant battle for their survival against the Nazis. That takes us just about to the end of the book, and if I say much more, I'll be giving too much away, so I'll stop at that point. I do have some excerpts that I'd like to read, if we've got a little bit of time, and then I can take whatever questions you might have. I should also mention that there are 4 main themes in this book. Of course, love is a major theme, because it's a love story. But not just the love between Jacob and Rachel. The love between Jacob and his parents, especially his father, was very, very deep and touching. Jacob and Rachel explore their young love in every way that they possibly can. Also, there's love of their community from Salzburg, the people that they used to socialize with, their friends and relatives. Another major theme in this book is faith. Belief that there's a purpose to events, that for one reason or another, God is creating this situation, and there's faith that they have some role to play. There's faith toward the end of the book, in prophecy. Jacob didn't want to believe his dreams really were prophetic, but eventually he had no choice because they kept coming true. So there's faith in God that he's giving him this gift. Courage is also a major piece of this book. Ordinary people who find the courage to do extraordinary things under unique situations. Jacob had to find the courage to lead others into battle and to trust that his dreams meant something. Rachel had to find the courage to break into Auschwitz to try and free her beloved Jacob. And Moshe had to find the courage to die with a noble purpose in mind. Rather than participate in medical experiments, he would do whatever he could to destroy those experiments and the people who were performing them. Well, perhaps the most unique and detailed portion of this book that I wanted to get across is guilt. My dad taught me many, many years ago that the most powerful of all human emotions is guilt. Guilt will drive people to do things that are unimaginable. And he was right. He wasn't just a good psychiatrist, but I've seen it, throughout my life that people are more motivated by guilt than any other emotion. Not only that, they carry it through their lives. It's not something that happens once, it's with them forever. So, the major characters have to deal with guilt on a continual basis. Jacob has to deal with the guilt of being a Sonderkommando for the rest of his life. He has to come to terms with the fact that he did horrible things to stay alive. Moshe has to deal with the guilt that he never got his family out in time, and he could have. Lots of Jews from Salzburg left. He didn't. His beloved wife died at Auschwitz. She was immediately scheduled for special treatment. He couldn't deal with that, so guilt. Perhaps the greatest guilt of all is actually falling upon Rachel. Poor Rachel deals with the guilt of being raped by the camp commandant, of being pregnant after that, of delivering a child, of hating that child, despising the child for who the father was, and then the guilt of growing to love the child. So there are complex themes in this book, but the one persistent theme might be that the characters are not archetypes of great people, flawless people. These people are real people with their own faults. They're not perfect, and they make mistakes, and they have to deal with their mistakes as they continue on. Okay, I'll read just a few passages, and then I can take some questions. The beginning of the book, just to set the tone. The dreary, dark winter of 1939-1940 began early in the Austrian Alps. Thick gray snow clouds rushed through the dark forest on their way to the frosty cliffs above. It was as though nature was preparing itself for the onslaught of terror soon to follow, freezing itself from the approaching evil. Here in the cold, dark Austrian mountains, the world slept peacefully, yet horror was on the horizon. For the few Jewish citizens of the city, 1939 marked the beginning of the end. Despite countless warning signs and numerous begging relatives, the Silverman family stayed in Europe when they should have left. Dr. Moshe Silverman silently observed these warnings, allowing too much time to pass before making a decision. He had a chance to leave Europe, as did many of his friends and acquaintances. He could have saved his wife Hannah and their precious child Jacob. But like so many others, he assumed the Nazi threat was only temporary. It would soon pass, he thought. This decision would haunt Moshe Silverman until his death. Jacob and his parents lived in a modest apartment, very well furnished. In most respects, they were typical upper-middle-class Austrians. Moshe was a well-respected physician. His wife Hannah volunteered with the community. Their son Jacob was a typical bright teenager. He was deeply in love with Rachel Goldberg, whose father was also a physician in Salzburg. They attended the same school, sometimes in the same classes. Like all adolescents, they explored their passions, desires, and dreams. And despite Nazi threats against Jews living in Austria, Jacob and Rachel assumed that these wonderful days would continue, if not blossom into something even more magnificent. Despite the warning signs, for them, life was superb. Soon, government policy forbade Jews from owning property. By 1938, Jewish doctors could no longer practice medicine in German hospitals. They could only serve other Jews. Jewish lawyers were forbidden from practicing law. Jewish professors were fired from university positions. Then, through forced relocation, Jews were moved into very undesirable parts of each city. These ghettos were filthy, had no running water, no electricity, and no city services. Dozens of Jews were forced to live in the space formerly occupied by one family. Professionals and successful artisans or business owners were astonished at such repulsive living conditions. Jews were forced to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothing and were soon barred from cafes, cinema, theaters, and other public places. They could shop only after the stores had served Gentiles, when the aisles were empty. Jews could no longer ride buses and were forced to stand in the back of trains. German soldiers around the ghetto maintained a strict curfew. Through openly hostile propaganda, Jews became an enemy of the government and the people. So in a short period of time, their lives went from great to bad to terrible. Chapter 2. Jacob's nightmare, his first prophetic dream. In the third-floor bedroom window of a tightly grouped set of gray apartment buildings, 17-year-old Jacob Silverman tossed and turned in his bed. A fierce winter storm had dumped new snow on the city overnight. I tried to use storm as a metaphor for the oncoming Nazis. Evergreen trees were bending with the stress of the ice and snow. They began to creak and moan with each gust of wind. Smoke drifted up from chimneys in the city above, surrounded by a sentinel of towering gray mountains. The heavy snow drifted into huge, rounded cliffs hanging across rooftops and piling against the sides of buildings. Engulfing this scene was breathtaking silence. Not even a bird call could be heard. In Salzburg, the world was asleep, at peace with this windswept isolation. Inside the apartment building, sweating profusely, Jacob's sleep was disturbed by a horrible vision. He was oblivious to the scratching of a tree branch against his window. Under closed lids, his eyes darted quickly in every direction. Young Jacob was experiencing the worst nightmare of his life. In this horrific nightmare, Jacob was older by several years. He was also extremely thin. More than that, he was emaciated. Jacob wore a strange costume. Gray pajamas with vertical red stripes. A Star of David was emblazoned upon the front. On his head was a cap of the same base fabric. He looked around the huge red brick-walled room, filled with acrid smoke and ash. It was some sort of furnace room. The heat was unbearable, and there was a disgusting odor. It smelled like burned meat, but not exactly. The stench was sickly sweet. Jacob stood in front of an enormous blazing oven. Mechanical trays were built in front of the openings into the fire. Men who were dressed like Jacob were continuously pushing large objects into the fire on the mechanical trays. Jacob couldn't see these very well because he had ashes in his eye. He didn't know what was going into the fire. The fire itself was so large and intense that it produced a deep thundering sound. It shook the foundations of the entire building. Jacob thought it sounded like a speeding locomotive. He was sweating profusely and lightheaded. He was also overwhelmed with exhaustion, and his muscles ached fiercely. Above the room, through cracks in the wooden floor, Jacob could see a towering chimney, belching thick clouds of ash and smoke. The fire was so intense that it erupted above the chimney. Like a monstrous flame atop a gigantic brick candle, the chimney pushed out prolific smoke. There was so much smoke above the building that Jacob could not tell if it was night or day. People scurried around the room. Each man seemed to have his own distinct duty in this strange factory. Their faces were coated with ash, giving them the appearance of white-faced actors in a sickening play. It was hard for Jacob to breathe without inhaling more of the ever-present ash. He was getting dizzy. All the while, fierce-looking black uniformed men with helmets and machine guns were shouting at the workers in German. The dark uniformed soldiers had the letters SS upon their collar. Just below the thundering sound of the fire, there were other sounds. Doors were opening and closing. Carts were crashing together. A large elevator screeched as it moved up and down, and workers carried carts with screeching wheels. But the tremendous deep roar of the furnace was overwhelming. It was deafening. Jacob wondered why people were yelling at him in German. Everyone he knew spoke Yiddish. Why would German soldiers be screaming at him? One soldier was irate and walking in his direction. Jacob's eyes continued to dart around the room. He tried to focus on the things that were being carried into the room. The items being burned were white and gray lumps of something, he thought. He rubbed his eyes again and again. Then, as his vision finally cleared, he was able to gaze into the furnace directly in front of him. Inside the blazing inferno, Jacob saw bodies. The reality of this horrendous concept burst upon his fragile mind. Jacob realized with sudden horror that the fire was filled with burning people. He began to get nauseous and retch. He doubled over as his stomach cramped, but there was no food to come up. He had been starving. Instead, a long, thin silver stream of mucus dripped from his gaping mouth, falling lazily to the dusty, ash-covered floor, but nothing else came out. As he focused on the bodies in the fire, Jacob saw that the victims were females of every age. Girls and women, all consumed in flames. Then suddenly 2 workers dumped a cart filled with more women and girls in front of Jacob's tray. All of the victims were naked. Their heads had been shaved. Some had a number tattooed on their left breast or arm. With no hair, they looked like large puffy dolls. Their bodies bounced and wiggled as they were picked up and placed on the trays. Some were soiled with feces and urine. Many had froth or blood coming from their nostrils and mouth. But none of them had bullet holes. Something else had killed them. Jacob's mind was bending under the weight of this terror. The faces of the dead appeared expressionless to Jacob, their eyes sunken and distant. They stared at him as though waiting for an explanation. If they could speak, he was certain that they would ask why he was about to burn them. Many of the bodies were purple on the top and white, were purple on the bottom and white on top. Some had tanned faces below white skulls, where their hair had been shaved. Jacob's mind stretched hard to comprehend this inconceivable panorama. It was too real to be a dream, and it was too frightening to be reality. He closed his eyes tightly and shook his head. All the while, the screaming German soldier was walking Jacob's way with hostility in mind. Jacob repeated to himself, "This can't be real, this can't be real." He then opened his eyes, but with the same dreadful result. The vile furnace room remained, and the German soldier who was screaming at him was getting closer. This is Jacob's dream in 1939, when nobody was even talking about death camps. Now, as horrible as that might be to swallow, this is a love story. So I also wanted to go into the same kind of depth about his feelings for Rachel. So in chapter 4, called Undying Love, Jacob remembers his first kiss with Rachel. Jacob knew that he was in love the first time that he had kissed Rachel. It was a life-changing event. They danced together at the bar mitzvah reception for the brother of a mutual friend. The klezmer band had been playing loud, raucous music much of the evening. They played Hava Nagila as everyone danced madly in circles. Eventually, the music slowed down. Jacob was not a good dancer, particularly when the music was slow. However, he could not take his hands off of Rachel. She was equally captivated by the moment. As the slow dance music filled the hall, they approached each other. At first, they were clumsy. Neither of them was very experienced with dancing. With rigid arms, they held their hands out, away from their bodies, which were separated by the distance of their arms. Neither of them danced with the beat. They were like stiff mannequins, or people made of wood. Their bodies moved, but not in unison. Still, there was something akin to electricity whenever they touched. Jacob quickly glanced around the dance floor to see who might be observing his error-filled performance. He was perspiring. His heart continued to race faster and faster. His dream girl was in his arms for the very first time. Jacob fretted desperately that Rachel might not feel the same way about him. He would have been devastated. Then their eyes met, and the world faded away. Everything in Jacob's peripheral vision seemed to diminish into darkness, while his body and Rachel's grew close. The sound of the band receded. It remained a soft reminder of the exterior world. Rachel curled her left arm around Jacob's neck. With tenderness, her fingers moved up the back of his head. She smiled shyly and played with his dark curly hair. At that moment, nothing in the world was more important than Rachel. Jacob observed every detail of her appearance and instantly committed it to memory. Her large brown eyes glistened. Her shiny hair curled up at the ends, in striking contrast to the stark white of her neck and shoulders. Ringlets curled on each side over her ears and neck. He remembered how vividly it shined, framing her face with sublime softness. Her nose was perfect, not too narrow or too wide. Her skin was warm, supple, and soft. He noticed every tiny imperfection. Her perfume was intoxicating. Everything about her radiated beauty, softness, and desire. Jacob was lost in her sparkling eyes. He placed his hand upon her face for the first time, cradling it in the soft, warm palm of his right hand. and drew her close to him. Their lips met in an epiphany of joy. Jacob wanted that moment to last forever, and in his mind, he knew it would. Nothing else mattered, not then, not ever. The band stopped playing. Jacob and Rachel stood in the center of the dance floor. Slowly they met in a glorious, passionate kiss. Jacob's heart was pounding so hard, he was certain that Rachel could feel it. As they looked back into each other's eyes, Jacob realized that it was the most perfect moment in his brief life. Their lives would never be the same again. So, as conditions get worse, Jacob and Rachel continue to explore their burgeoning romance, their sexuality. Even in Theresienstadt, where they were captives, they found time once in a while to make love and to be close. And after they did that once in the school building when nobody else was there, for the first time Jacob realized that his dream might really be a prophecy. And he begins to wonder, why am I here? What's our purpose? What's going to happen and what's my role in here? Jacob lay next to Rachel and stared into the rafters of the school building. His mind was spinning. Life can be so beautiful and so terrifying at the same time. How alone we are. How painful it is to be trapped within this shell of bone and muscle. What peculiar, sad creatures we are. We are a universe within our soul, inside a universe of souls. Life is so much more precious than I thought it was. The threat of death now permeates my senses. Darkness unfolds its evil intention all around me, yet I am unable to make an end of it. I believe that I'm supposed to do something. The signs cannot be wrong, yet I'm confused. I am blind in the most important time to see. What am I supposed to do? Time goes on, they escape. Rachel stays with the partisans, Jacob is recaptured, and as I mentioned, eventually they are deported from Theresienstadt and put on a train to Auschwitz. As they arrive at Auschwitz, Jacob looks through the cracks of the cattle car and he sees the approaching camp. Through cracks and holes in the train, Jacob observed several large buildings and guard towers behind a huge iron gate. A great deal of smoke was coming from one of the buildings directly ahead, while more smoke could be seen from buildings about a mile or two to the left. The train passed through the large iron gate surrounded by a huge curving concrete facade. In the distance to the right, factories loomed, with smokestacks belching thick gray smoke into the black night sky. Snowflakes flew around and through the train's smoke as it entered the unloading area. Above the curved concrete entrance to the camp was a wrought iron sign that said, in German, "Work will make you free. Arbeit macht frei." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. I've seen that sign. It was in my dream. Oh, dear sweet God, this can't be happening. It was only a dream. He began sweating, although he was freezing cold. He felt lightheaded and dizzy. It was the dream in which Jacob was killed because he refused to burn the corpses of Jews. The curving black metal sign was identical to the sign in his dream. Jacob's mind was stretching to the limits of sanity. How could a dream come true? He looked down to see that his hands were trembling. This was impossible. But no matter how hard he tried to believe that he was in a dream now, he understood that this was real life. He could not wake himself. Jacob saw that an electrified fence surrounded the camp. Guard towers were on each side. He watched as a large group of people walked in their direction from a construction site in the distance to the left. Even at night, this strange place was bustling with activity. Dozens of rows of barracks were now visible behind the train station. As far as the eye could see were identical brown barracks. To the right, Jacob saw a low brick building with large, tall smokestacks belching out a prodigious amount of smoke. Jacob thought it was strange the fire was coming out the top. What else could the Nazis be burning that would cause fire to come all the way up out of the top of the smokestack? No, this can't be happening. If his dream was really coming true, then Jews were being slaughtered and their corpses burned in this terrible new death camp. On the verge of fainting, Jacob slumped against the side of the train. "What's wrong with you?" asked the old man next to Jacob. "You look like you've just seen a ghost." Jacob, now curled up tightly on the floor, replied, "I think I've seen a lot of ghosts." Moshe writes a letter to his son Jacob just before he dies, rather than perform medical experiments on his own people. The war is almost over, but he's not going to make it. January 9th, 1945. My dear sweet son, know that I think of you and Rachel constantly. I pray that you are alive and that one day you and Rachel will have a normal life. I'm sorry that I will not be able to be a part of it. I'm sorry that my grandchildren will not know me. I hope that you understand why, my wise son. I cannot by action or will cause harm to anyone. I swore that oath when I became a physician. The terror of Nazi Germany has led us to this horrible place and taken your mother's life. There is nothing I can do that will bring her back. Yet it may be within my power to damage the Nazi Reich, if only in a small way. Before I leave this earth, I will do whatever is within my power to stop the madness that is destroying our people. All of the signs that confused me in the past have become clear in this terrible prison. When I was a child, an angel told me about you. I did not fully comprehend it until we arrived in this place of death and torture. You were meant to be here, in this evil place and time. God has chosen you to bravely save others. Jacob, the future of our people is in your hands. Fulfill your destiny. Become the leader you were born to be. One day soon, God's plan will be enacted through your mind and your will. Jacob, the destiny of your courage has arrived. This will be my last communication with you, my beloved son. If there is a God in heaven, we will meet again. I love you more than I can describe. More importantly, my son, I wish you the greatest pleasure that life can bring. Have children. Teach them how to be good, learned Jews. Teach them how to help others. They will be the future of our race. Think of your mother and me as your life unfolds. Remember the past. We are all a product of those who came before us. They produced a light for us to follow. Jacob, that light is now almost gone. The future of Judaism is now up to you. Rebuild our people from the ashes of this terrible conflagration. Do not allow our Jewish way of life to disappear. With all of my heart, Father. The next day, Moshe dies, killing a Nazi doctor. Meanwhile, Jacob is haunted by the visions of the lines waiting for the gas chamber. Jacob looked into the eyes of the adults from the orchestra stand. He saw that most of them understood their destiny. Unlike the bright, energetic smiles of the children, the adult smiles were mostly forlorn and sad in appearance. They looked anxious. A few seemed agitated. Many of these people were badly weakened by the effects of their long and painful journey. Some had been forged to stand upright in cattle cars.
It has to go up, doesn't it? It's on a groove.
Jacob recalled how he had felt upon entering Auschwitz, although it now seemed ages ago. The Germans used starvation as a tool to keep the prisoners weak and unable to fight back. It would have been useless to fight back anyway. Those incoming prisoners who ran were simply shot before they could reach the electrified fences. They marched on in Jacob's dreams while he played Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, or Wagner. He wondered if he would ever be able to forget the smiles of the naive, doomed children.
Mr. Weinblatt? We take questions. Okay.
That's pretty much it. Okay. Questions? Stephen?
Okay, did you actually visit what places in Europe where these things took place?
Never been there. Most of my research was done through the internet. I've seen movies, lots of movies, documentaries, as well as fiction. I did purchase a book that was very, very helpful called Holocaust by DeWar and Van Pelt. But I got tons of material from the internet. And because of my disability, I'm grateful that I was able to do that. I probably wouldn't have been able to write the book without it. Other questions? In case anybody's interested in taking a look at this later, as I was writing the book after I had already started, my mother got a package from her cousin in New York. And it included a chart of her family from Russia. And for the first time, I realized my grandfather had 5 brothers and sisters. All of them died in the Holocaust. Not only that, all of their children died in the Holocaust. Only a handful survived. Questions? Other questions? Yes?
Your book is available where?
In the back of the room. I brought a few with me. In case anybody's interested, I'd be happy to sell you one and even autograph it if you'd like.
Is it also available in stores?
I can't guarantee it's going to be on any particular bookshelf at any store, but I know that it's available through all of the major retailers, Amazon, Target, Borders, Barnes & Noble, Powell's. So if it's not on a bookshelf somewhere, any of those places can order it, or you can order it online through any of those retail stores.
Well, thank you so very, very much. This was really a fascinating story. So, on a lighter note, to keep chronological that story, here is a copy of Homeland, the Creation of the State of Israel, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and there's a nice little plaque inside for you to remember why you received this book. So thank you so very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. We'll see everybody in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. We were able to reschedule the Assistant Dogs of America, so they will be.